Hello, everyone. My name's Danny Sriskandrajah. I'm Chief Executive of Oxfam Great Britain. On behalf of colleagues here at Oxfam, thank you for joining us for this webinar. We've got an hour to talk about, arguably the most important thing facing humanity today, which is our response, our collective response to climate breakdown. And we've got a month to go before the climate talks kick off in Glasgow. And I'm coming to you from the UK, which is obviously the host and where the UK government has stated its ambition to make this COP matter on a range of fronts. And we at Oxfam wanted to convene this discussion a few weeks ahead of COP to look at an issue that's obviously been at the heart of Oxfam's work for all of the 80 or so years we've been around, which is what's happening to the poorest and most marginalized people on the planet. And for us at Oxfam, we've been looking at several dimensions through which climate breakdown and even the climate action that's being planned might be negatively impacting on the lives and livelihoods of the poorest and most marginalized people on the planet. And we're already seeing it, for example, that the hardest hit when it comes to the impacts of climate breakdown are people who are being displaced from countries in the global south. Our estimate is that 20 million people a year over the last decade were displaced because of extreme weather events that were caused by climate change. We've also calculated, for example, that these people had the least to do with the emissions that have resulted in climate change. We think 10% of the world's richest population have contributed to about half of all emissions over the 25 years leading up to 2015. And so there is a climate justice question here that those people who have had the least to do with climate change are facing already the brunt of the impacts of climate change, and that's only going to get worse if we don't act now. A second dimension, of course, is around the actions that are being planned, that businesses, governments are talking about, might also have unintended and negative consequences on the poorest around the world. And a good example are those net zero pledges that are being made. They're really important parts of our collective action. But we recently tried to calculate the levels of the amount of land that would be needed around the world if we're to sort of total up all of the various commitments made to planting new forests around the world. And unless we find and prove and scale up new technology, we're looking at ludicrous amounts of land that will be required. 1.6 billion hectares of land will be required over the next few years. And our worry is, even if we come close to achieving that level of afforestation, it'll have disastrous impacts on food security, on food prices that are already rising, unless we really take concerted action to make sure that climate action and action on food security are really linked. And a third question, which I hope we'll get into quite a bit over the next hour, is who pays? Who pays for adaptation? Who pays for loss and damage in the poorer parts of the world? And we know that it's an agenda item on this COP as well as it has been in recent COPs, and that's another concern for many people in the developing world. And finally, if we look ahead to the long term and to the just transition that we all desperately want, desperately need, there's also a risk that we end up with a two-tier system where some economies, some countries are able to transition into green growth while others are being left behind or trapped in using outdated technologies. And so wherever we look, whether it's the immediate impacts today or the long-term impacts on the question of the sort of unintended consequences of action today or who pays, this nexus between climate and poverty is real. It's far too real for far too many people. And we thought it'd be useful and timely to talk about those issues. And I'm really, really happy to have an amazing panel with us today to talk about those linkages. Now, you'll see on the screen before you two of the four panelists that we hope to have with us today. Nigel Topping, who I suspect many of you will know, is the UK's high-level champion for climate action. He's been working throughout most of his career to boost action and I suppose collaboration as well, Nigel, on environmental action. And before this, he was CEO of the We Mean Business Coalition, And before that, he was executive director of the Carbon Disclosure Project. And for me, he's one of the most eloquent and urgent champions of the need for both action and collaboration. We're also joined by Nicole Lovett, who's Burberry's responsibility director. And at Burberry, Nicole oversees climate strategy and community programs, ESG reporting. And Nicole, like Nigel, is I suspect, a lifelong champion of these issues. Prior to Burberry, she was director of CSR at Deutsche Bank. And before that, she led Diageo's CSR work in Africa. And I'm really happy that, Nicole, you're able to join us, because at Oxfam, we're proud of the partnership we have with Burberry. And we're particularly interested in the plans you've set out on climate positive, which we'll get to in a bit. And we've just been joined by Professor Saleemul Huq. Saleem is one of my, can I call you a climate hero? Today, he's director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development. He's climate science professor at the Independent University of Bangladesh. He's a lead author of IPCC reports. He's an advisor to various UN agencies. But for me, I remember meeting Saleem, I think about 15 years ago, when you were at the IIED, the International Institute for Environment and Development. And back then, I remember listening to you talk about the injustice of what was happening around climate change and the real impacts in the developing world, but also the opportunities of adaptation, of what we now call a just transition, and how important that will be to not just saving the planet, but to empowering the poorest on the planet. And we've also been joined by Fiona Harvey, who I suspect many of you will know, because she is the Guardian newspaper's environment correspondent. Before that, she was environment correspondent at the Financial Times. And for, I think, at least 15 years, if I've been tracking your byline, you've been an analyst and commentator on environmental matters, including at numerous COPs. I'll ask you how many COPs you've been to in a second, Fiona. But when I read your work, I can see the sort of sharp analytical mind you bring to many of these questions we're going to be dealing with, including, I think, calling out some of the inconsistencies and contradictions in what we're hearing about in climate change. Saleem, can I come to you, please? And before you joined, I was talking about Oxfam's interest in this nexus between climate and poverty. And could you please describe to us, what are you seeing in parts of the global south in terms of the real lived impact of climate breakdown?
Thank you very much, Danny, and thank you for inviting me here. So, as you know, I have moved back from the UK to Bangladesh now. I'm based in Dhaka, Bangladesh, at the Independent University of Bangladesh, and I've set up a center there called the International Center for Climate Change and Development. And Bangladesh is very much at the front end, or the front lines, of tackling climate change, having to deal with the impacts of climate change. Bangladesh is very often ranked either number 1, number 2, or number 3 in any global ranking of most vulnerable developing countries, and we certainly are. But I think the narrative in Bangladesh has moved away from vulnerability to resilience, and we are well on the way to hopefully becoming the most resilient country from the most vulnerable country, and on the pathway to becoming more adaptive, to reducing our emissions of greenhouse gases, and making our people more resilient to deal with the impacts of climate change, from cyclones to floods to droughts and heat waves and so on. They're still happening, they still do a lot of damage, but Bangladesh has been able to develop our capacity to deal with them, to overcome them, to manage the risk, and to be able to thrive despite that risk. We are currently celebrating 50 years as a nation of independence, a fairly young country. We had been written off by the likes of Henry Kissinger as a basket case. We are now developing, well on the way to graduating from least developed country status to middle income country status, despite being one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change. So I would say Bangladesh's story is no longer just as victim and vulnerability, although that's still true. We are vulnerable and victims of climate change, but we are overcoming that and we're well on the way to dealing with it. And now, in the current situation, the rest of the world is going to have to deal with it, including the rich countries. And I would argue they are not as well prepared as Bangladesh is, and they may well learn some lessons from Bangladesh on how to prepare themselves going forward.
Great, thank you, Saleem. We'll come back perhaps to some of those lessons that we might learn, but I should just say, I should have said it at the start, we will get to some question and answers, and you can submit questions by going down to the bottom of your screen and to where the Q&A icon is and submitting a question that we'll see, and I'll try to call up as many. But I think you're also welcome to put up your hand and we'll bring you in if you'd like to ask your question. It's you can't see who's on the call, but I can see a fantastic list of people, many of whom are amazing supporters and partners of Oxfam, who I know care deeply about this link between climate and poverty. Nigel, you were in Milan yesterday at the Youth COP, and so you will have heard, I'm going to quote Greta Thunberg say, "Build back better, blah, 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 green economy, blah, 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 net zero by 2050, blah, blah, blah. This is all we hear from our so-called leaders." You're the high-level champion for climate change and climate action, trying to galvanize action. Do you see the world in the same way? How optimistic are you?
Well, I'm mixed. I mean, I'm optimistic in some ways, but there's, far from being naively optimistic. I mean, unfortunately, what's not been so well reported is the very, very good speech that Vanessa Nakate gave, which was actually much more thoughtful and started with her describing the very real human impacts of climate breakdown in her hometown and an incident involving someone in her neighborhood dying, which, so she had the whole audience kind of emotionally gripped. And then she went on to make the very, very strong case for addressing loss and damage in a serious way. And some of the blah, blah, blah actually was quite insulting to some of the young leaders in the room who'd worked very hard to bring people together for just the kind of gathering which was dismissed as being irrelevant. Many of them are in green jobs, which are dismissed as being irrelevant. So I think it's a shame that the focus has all been on that speech, because there was a lot of really, really deep, thoughtful conversation about how we get in solution mode, which is what we're all trying to do. But of course, I also recognize the frustration that despite all the blah, 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 the latest NDC summary says we're on track to increase emissions by 2030, far from reducing them. So all of the challenges around resilience are just going to be made harder. I do think that, I really think that Saleem's reframing away from a victim-only narrative to a yes victim, let's not hide away from the historical and ongoing injustices, but also empowered, responsible, responsive, taking charge of one's own future, and sure, asking for solidarity. So this is such a complex, look, global poverty, global climate breakthrough, two of the most complicated issues, and we're talking about the nexus, so they're intertwined, right, in terms of all sorts of power imbalances and structural challenges. But I think the sophistication of the conversation yesterday amongst 400 delegates chosen from every country in the world because of their leadership on climate change is really encouraging, right? And it's also a grasping for solidarity across the generations as well, right? It's not an abdication of, no one's giving up in that room. I'd say solidarity across nations and across generations. So I'm optimistic mainly because I think there's for two reasons. One, there's real momentum in the real economy in terms of solutions, particularly on the mitigation side, right? And there's real money starting to flow at scale on renewables, and sector by sector you can start to see the dominoes falling. There's much less progress being made on this resilience agenda. It's why, inspired and advised by Saleem and others who've been working on the resilience agenda much longer than I have. My expertise really is in business and technology and driving change through capital markets in the global north. So in this new role, I'm 18 months in, but it still feels very new. I've got a global responsibility across the three pillars of the Paris Agreement, so including resilience and finance. So I think we have a lot of work to do to raise the sophistication of the conversation about how do we build resilient solutions? How do we mobilize the trillions, not just the billions, to create the kind of breakthroughs we need all over the world? So I think that resilience work is a long way behind the mitigation work. It's attracted a lot less funding, a lot less attention. That itself is a structural bias to the global north. So I think there's a real need to bring the conversation into and ground it in the experience of communities in the global south who, I think, in the negotiations are too often framed as victims only. Whereas, as I've learned from Saleem and Sheila Patel and other advisors, this sort of resourcefulness that comes from having been confronted with the challenges of climate change in your face is something for the world to learn from. I visited Louisiana not long ago. Similarly, within the states, Louisiana has got a head start in thinking about resilience, but they're starting to have others, just as Saleem was saying, you're starting to have other countries come and ask Bangladesh what you've done. Louisiana's having other states in America asking them how they think about resilience and how they're building resilient solutions.
Great, thank you. Fiona, how many COPs have you been to?
14. Quite a few.
Quite a few. And
yeah.
How optimistic are you about this one, in particular around some of the action and resources we need to see going to developing countries?
Yeah, well, the thing about this COP is that we didn't do enough of all the previous COPs, and now we're running out of time. So, as we heard from the IPCC, we had the most astonishing report from the IPCC this summer. It really made it very stark and very clear how close we are to irretrievable climate breakdown, and how much we need to do to prevent that. But we need to get ourselves on that path. We need to really this is people are admitting now that the goal, the overarching goal of COP26 originally, which was to get all of the NDCs in shape, to get a coherent plan that will have every country on that path to 1.5 degrees. That was always a very, very high ambition, and we're not going to quite get that. But that does not mean that COP26 is in any way destined to fail, because although what we get out of COP26 will not be perfect, it can still be really, really good. It can still set us on a path that keeps us to 1.5 degrees, and anything that we don't quite get at this COP, we come back to in years.
Oh, you've just dropped out. Oh. Could you start that sentence again, please?
Every country to come with the best commitments that they can to COP.
Fiona, your sound is breaking up for some reason. I'm not sure exactly why.
COP26. Is that better? Okay.
Now it's better. Yeah.
Not giving me any reason why it's breaking up.
Yeah. Yeah. One more try. Let's go.
Yeah. But I was just saying that we can, at this COP, still keep 1.5 alive. We can still keep a pathway to 1.5 if countries come with a good level of ambition. So there is still everything to play for at COP26. We may not get everything sewn up. We may not solve climate change at this COP, but we can get close enough to ensure that future generations will not be facing a 3-degree world as they would have been if everyone had just stuck to the Paris commitments. So we really can keep 1.5 alive, and I think that is the crucial thing at this COP.
Thank you. So, Nicole, I did mention earlier about Climate Positive 2040, which is, I believe, Burberry's plan or action plan. Could you tell us a bit more about it? What does it mean and what's in it?
Absolutely. So, for all the reasons that have just been highlighted, it's really important for us to take urgent action to address climate impacts. And business does have a significant role to play in doing this. And it's interesting just to hear Fiona talking about the 1.5 and keeping that alive. And that's really been the premise behind our whole raising our ambition. It really sits with us as a brand because, you know, sustainability has always been key to our brand values, and our founder was always a lover of nature and exploration and really wanted to see it there for generations to come. And for us as well, sustainability is really essential to our long-term future. And we want to be loved for another 165 years. So it's really, really essential. And that kind of sits behind our climate positive pledge, because we want to raise the ambitions around our previous kind of net zero target to 2040 and accelerate it in line with the 1.5 degree trajectory, so that we could actually contribute in a meaningful way towards the Paris Agreement 1.5 goal. So climate positive is all about accelerating our reductions to 2030, and we aim to reduce our value chain emissions by 46% by 2030, in addition to supporting wider global climate change efforts that really go beyond our value chain, where we can actually support more wider efforts where they're needed. As an industry, we're starting to see some green shoots in terms of how our industry is starting to address the climate crisis, and we know that, you know, as an industry we need to do a lot more. We have something like 49% of the industry is signed up to Race to Zero, and that's encouraging, but equally there's a lot of room for improvement there, and we need to encourage a lot more of our peers to actually come on board and to increase their ambitions to 1.5 degrees as well, because collectively we need to be on the same path, we need to be on the same journey together, and we can't solve this alone. And if I just come back to, it's interesting in terms of some of the kind of broader public attitudes to kind of our climate positive, but also from our customer perspective, with, you know, our customers are really enlightened. They're really savvy, and they know what it means for a brand to go out there and talk about their climate ambitions, and they really want to trust in brands that they're doing the right thing, because it means that they can make sustainable choices. And so therefore we, you know, that's our duty of care to really support our customers doing that. But we also want to encourage them to do more as well, and to value their products for a lot longer, and to keep them in the system as well, you know, so it can be loved for a lifetime, as we like to think of our products. And you know, and in doing so, we will help them by providing different services like resale options or repair services, so that they can come to us and we can support them in terms of making sure that their products are there for a lifetime, and continue to look for innovative new ways to support them do that.
Great, thank you. I'm particularly happy that we're talking about fashion, because it's secondhand September, and supporters of Oxfam will know we've challenged our community to not buy any new clothes during September, and hopefully longer. And that's because, as you say, you know, we don't think about it, but I think fashion contributes something like 4% of all carbon emissions around the world. So, and it's our addiction to sort of fast fashion, which has a disastrous impact on the planet, but also through underpaid, you know, garment workers on people's livelihoods. So it's great that you're stepping up. Now, I don't quite know where Fiona has gone, but hopefully her connection is going to be restored in a second. Now, I've got some, here she is. Thanks. Good to see you back, Fiona. We've got some questions coming in already, and I'm going to start posing them as I see them. Please feel free to pop them in. Nigel, I'm going to come to you first. It's from an anonymous attendee. My question is, what are Nigel's thoughts on avoiding a future of disaster capitalism, avoiding the wealthiest profiting from the climate crisis on the backs of those with the least, as those with the least are pushed even further into an emergency?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of goes to your earlier comments, Danny, about the risk of a kind of twin track net zero future. I mean, fundamentally, that's about two things, right? It's about policy and it's about international collaboration. And so I think, you know, I hope that we're coming to end what I see as the second great age of greed. You know, the first age was this sort of unfettered experiment in complete free markets in the Victorian age, which led to what Polanyi calls the Great Transformation and the emergence of, you know, organized labor, child labor rules, health and safety at work rules, ultimately the welfare state. And we've lived through this sort of fantasy that, you know, unfettered capitalism will deliver prosperity for all. We know that. We know that's a fantasy. Right? We know that you need guardrails around markets so that markets, which are very powerful, deliver what society actually wants. Not a fantasy that somehow that what society wants will be delivered without actually thinking about it. So, I mean, I see encouraging things like the OECD agreeing minimum global corporate taxation rates, right? And that's one way in which businesses get away from paying a fair share for the common goods of like education and infrastructure that are serviced through taxation. And that's important because otherwise we end up just having a kind of race to the bottom between countries trying to attract inward investment, right? So I think that's a really encouraging move, that OECD move. I think you see other interesting moves like the World Business Council is just launching a business commission on equality, looking at questions like should the Burberrys of this world, the biggest businesses in the world, be lobbying for advocating for minimum wages in their whole supply chains, right? And again, it's hard, right? Because you kind of need the whole system to move at once, otherwise you end up with the people who arbitrage and end up winning. So you need, that's why ultimately it needs policy, but business can play a huge role in that shift. And I think the you know, there are really good examples within climate policy. If you look at the way that California, for example, uses the income from its carbon pricing, it uses it to accelerate the green transition, and it uses it to address fuel poverty. So but there's no guarantee without more policy change that solving climate change will solve income inequality, right? So we have to pay attention to both at the same time.
Thanks. Any other panelists want to come in on that question? No, I'll move on to another one from Vincenzo in Milan. Are we going to tackle the issue of REDD+, that's reducing emissions from deforestation and degraded forests, REDD projects negatively affecting local communities and equatorial regions? So I suppose this comes back to this sort of trade-off that we were trying to look at Oxfam in our tightening the net report, which is, you know, we're taking these actions, but they're having, in some cases, huge consequences on land rights, on food security, on local ecosystems. Is there enough awareness of these trade-offs, and are they being managed as well as they could be? Saleem, Fiona?
Well, let me take it up. I'm not an expert in REDD per se, but I think the more general question is even the most well-intentioned interventions to tackle climate change, when it hits the rubber on the road with particularly vulnerable communities, very often can be quite maladaptive. And in fact, you know, there's been a recent study of adaptation projects that have been taken, again, with the best intention in the world, around the world, to support local communities that haven't in fact helped in the end. Some of them even ended up being what one might call maladaptations. So, you know, you take care of vulnerability in one sense, but then vulnerability increases in another sense. So ill thought out and ill planned, and the key deficiency in my view is not consulted enough with local populations. So, you know, my work has been very much with vulnerable communities at the front lines of dealing with climate change and enabling them to be the arbiters and the deciders and the decision makers and the actors in what is best for them, and not be told what to do or even provided support in a ham-handed manner that doesn't support them effectively and doesn't build on their own capacities and knowledge. And I think that's really what is being referred to here in the REDD+ cases. There have been quite a few cases of REDD+ projects, again, well-intentioned projects that have actually not benefited those who have been ignored and run roughshod over. So in my view, it's a very strong case for a bottom-up consultation-based approach to anything that is done in the name of either poverty alleviation or climate change. There needs to be a consultation and inputs from the local communities. Nigel mentioned youth meeting, and communities also need to be brought into the picture much more systematically and given a voice and given their knowledge and experience to contribute as well.
Thanks. Fiona, any thoughts on that question?
Thank you. Yes, I don't know about these specific REDD+ projects in Africa that the questioner has brought up, but I do know we have looked, my colleagues and I have looked at various carbon offsetting projects, some of them involving REDD, some of them involving other voluntary offsets, and many of them are problematic because it is very difficult when you're trying to say, that a project is avoiding deforestation, for instance, that they're keeping trees standing. It's hard to say, whether those trees were in danger, whether, the local environment is being well served by the project, whether local people are being involved. It's hard to say that when you're, sitting in an office in England and buying offsets. It's hard to know exactly what's happening on the ground in these projects. So I think there does need to be a lot more scrutiny of REDD+ and other carbon offsetting projects. However, I don't think that we should be throwing away carbon offsetting and carbon trading altogether necessarily, because if you're going to do that, then you need to find some other way of financing forests, keeping forests standing. Because one of the most important things that we can do in reaching net zero is to keep our carbon sinks, to keep the Amazon and the forests in Africa and the forests all around the world, to keep them intact, to stop logging them and burning them and degrading them in one way or another. A lot of effort and focus goes into planting trees, but keeping the trees that we have is even more important. So we need to find a way to do that. And so far, the only way that we've found as a world of doing that is through carbon trading. So it's not a perfect system, but if you're going to throw that away at this late stage of the game, then you better be really, really sure you've got something else in place. And I don't see anything else in place. So this argument's going to come up at COP26 because there's this thing called Article 6, which is a part of the Paris Agreement that involves carbon trading. And part of carbon trading is, forests getting carbon credits for keeping forests standing. So these issues are very much interlinked. There was a big row over Article 6 at the last COP in Madrid in 2019, because some people want to get rid of Article 6 and not have carbon trading at all. Other people think carbon trading is essential, and there are, various points in between those two points of view. The problem is the COP in Madrid, the last COP, it fell apart on this issue. Really, it was pretty. We can't afford to have that happen again at COP26.
Oh, you're dropping in and out again.
So we need to find a good compromise answer on Article 6 for COP26, and that may not be, that may not be satisfying to everyone. More important this a lot to
Okay, thank you. That last bit just dropped out, but Nigel, yep, go ahead.
Yeah, just I mean, really building on Saleem and Fiona's point. I mean, I really agree with Fiona's last point that we should be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, because yes, not all schemes are perfect. But remember, there is also, as Saleem said, very good intention behind this, like paying people to maintain standing forests or other ecosystem services to overcome the incentive they have currently with no payment for that to actually cut trees down. And when these schemes work, they provide new flows of income, often to vulnerable communities who are then, able. And when I was in Kenya earlier in the year, stories of communities able to then put their kids through university. I mean, transformational when they work, right? So the key is when they work. So as Fiona says, don't throw it away, but fix it. I think that the IUCN have convened a very long process of coming up with a nature-based solutions standard. And I'll post a link. One of the criteria in there is stakeholder inclusion throughout the life cycle. So not just at the beginning, to Fiona's point, now something can be well set up, but they have to last. So I think that's part of our collective learning, right? Is that you don't include stakeholders. If you make it up in an office in London, as Fiona says, then you're probably going to screw it up. But if you include stakeholders, you've got a much better chance of a greater proportion of schemes being successful. You won't foolproof everything. So I think we've just got to keep learning. And Article 6, the key issues are you have to have environmental integrity. We can't have standards which allow people to pay for things which don't actually make any difference. And we have to have just normal market discipline, like no double counting. Those are the things we shouldn't be arguing about. So we have to find that practical compromise. Alok Sharma is just on his way out to Milan for this pre-COP where ministers will be getting into the weeds of some of these issues. So I'm hoping that the spirit of compromise will very much, pragmatic compromise in the interest of the whole will very much be alive and well in Milan the next few days.
Yeah, look, from an Oxfam point of view, I think one of our frustrations, echoing or building on what you've all said, is that the sort of sustainable and participatory solutions are out there. There are fantastic agroecological projects that involve afforestation, but also sustainable livelihoods, that involve community participation, that don't involve land grabs, that don't involve large-scale monocultural plantations of acacia, and we just need to create a regulatory framework and create sufficient incentives for those things to be the norm rather than where this sort of trade-off is. I'm going to come to the question of what success at COP looks like, but first, Nicole, there's a question here for you, from someone saying it's great to hear about Burberry's proactive work. You mentioned how the fashion industry needs to do more, and Burberry will support that. What does that mean practically? Is it what, besides being a really good role model? I mean, how are you working in partnership with others in your sector, I suppose, is what this is being asked by another anonymous attendee.
No, that's absolutely. I mean, it's a great question. And the fact is that our value chain represents something like 98% of our impact, certainly for Burberry. So, we have to work with others in order to actually make a difference in terms of making that decarbonisation of our value chain. And the supply chains are really complex, certainly for the fashion industry. It's just got, it covers so many geographies and it covers so many processes right at the farm level through to the end producers. And in many cases, certainly amongst our luxury peers, we share very similar kind of supply chain partners. So, we need to work together in terms of being able to, not all, can you imagine being a partner or supply chain and having multiple people coming at you for the same thing? So we need to standardize what it is that we're trying to do, collectively help and bring them on board in terms of understanding all the environmental impacts that we're looking to address and how it is that they can do that in a phased and progressive way. So it's not, too daunting for them. And we need to provide them with the tools, the training, and the actual kind of scaled up programs so that people do go into their manufacturers and actually work with them in terms of what they can do. And so, working with other industry collaborations like the UN Fashion Charter, the G7 Fashion Pact, are really ways in which we can actually work on some of that standardization in terms of what is it that we can get better, and where is it that we need to direct our efforts to make the biggest impact, whether that is about helping them to access renewable energy supplies, so increasing their water efficiencies, gaining certifications, the list goes on. There's so many things, but we need to be able to come together so it is coordinated and progressive. So, yeah.
Thank you. Now, I just want to turn to the question of success at COP. Oxfam's taking a very small delegation to Glasgow this year, and one of our number will be a smallholder farmer from Uganda called Margaret. At the end of COP, what will someone like Margaret take away that should be reassuring in terms of her and her community's livelihoods for years and decades to come? What does success look? What can we hope for? What can Margaret hope for? Who'd like to go first?
I can talk
yeah,
a little
Fiona.
bit. I think that what Margaret can hope for is a deal that keeps 1.5 degrees alive. And that's a really important point, because if you remember, 6 years ago at Paris, what we were talking about was mainly 2 degrees. And we know from the IPCC in the meantime that the difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees is actually huge. And that would make a huge difference to Margaret and to people in similar situations all around the world. You see great increases in extreme weather, in heat waves, in droughts, in floods, in fiercer storms and so on. You see a massive increase between 1.5 and 2 degrees. They don't sound very far apart, 1.5 and 2 degrees, but we know now that in terms of the climate, they are. So the fact that we are focused on 1.5 degrees now, which was only an aspiration in Paris, it wasn't the kind of the firm goal. The firm goal set in the Paris Agreement is 2 degrees. The fact that we are now all focused on 1.5 degrees is actually a huge step forward in itself. May not seem like that, but actually it is a really important move. And so if we can get to an agreement in Glasgow that sets a pathway to staying within 1.5 degrees, then actually that will represent huge progress on the Paris Agreement. It won't be perfect. And, I'm afraid I don't think anyone at Glasgow will be able to give Margaret reassurance that she won't be affected by climate change, or that her children won't, or that, that her life will not have to change in some way. But hopefully what we can do is give people assurances that we are now finally, after not doing very well on climate change for many years, that we are now putting ourselves as a world on the right path.
Thank you. Saleem, you've got your hand up.
Great, thank you very much. Just building up on Fiona's comment, which I agree with entirely, the 1.5 degree has to be kept in mind and as an achievement. But having, being one of the few people who's been to all 25 COPs so far, I can give her some advice on what to expect at the event. And I hope Oxfam can facilitate that. And I would divide it between the advocacy messages, which we're just talking about right now, and the more you can get her to talk to, story to them, those are very useful. But the rest of the time, I would say networking with like-minded groups and people, and particularly the non-state actors who are going to be there, even though in reduced numbers, many of them will be there. Nigel will be there working with them. I will be there. We'd love to talk to Margaret about practice resilience forward in reality on the ground, because in my mind, that is a very, very powerful way for citizens themselves to become actors, not just advocates to their leaders to do the right thing, which we should do, but also do the right things ourselves and make us a tremendous opportunity for us. And I'd love to meet Margaret when she's in Glasgow, Danny.
Yeah, Nigel, yes. Thanks, Saleem.
Again, building on and agreeing with my fellow panelists, one of the things that we've done, we launched the Race to Zero, and I really agree with Fiona. We often forget now, because it's become so normal, that kind of consensus that we're going to zero, that we're aiming for 1.5 is it's a monumental step forward. And the number of organizations committing, and yes, not all of them have got robust plans yet, but we can all hold them accountable now that they've publicly said we're going, so Nicole, Nicole knows what it's like. You commit, and then there's a hell of a lot of staff work to put the plans together, then you publish the plans, and then you're held accountable. And there's more and more investors and civil society organizations holding people accountable. But in addition, it's this key work on resilience. And one of the things that we've tried to do with the Race to Resilience, very much inspired by Saleem and Sheila Patel and others who've been working on resilience in communities for so long, is to actually try and bring the narrative of resilience alive. It can be very technical in the COPs. So it's all terms of art that if you've been to 10 or 15 or 25 COPs, you can speak COP-ese. But if you're an ordinary smallholder farmer or a slum or an organizer of a women's group in a slum, you probably don't understand. Or even adaptation and resilience as a conjunct is an artificial phrase, right? So we've tried to build this campaign around lives and livelihoods in the most vulnerable communities, coastal and river-based communities, the urban poor, and smallholder farmers. There's something like 2 billion people in the world rely on the income of smallholder farmers. That's a quarter of the world's population, and that's one of the most vulnerable groups. So two things to look out for. And again, Danny, it'd be great to connect Margaret. One, some of the non-state actor initiatives. I'm hoping we'll see quite a lot of big food players coming together to commit to work much more with the farmer community, whole value chain approach to resilience. And also within the Race to Resilience, we have some really interesting initiatives that are particularly focused on, for example, providing access to digital and micro insurance to smallholder farm. If you're my brother-in-law's, if futures markets were invented to respond to the needs of rice farmers in Japan, a lot of insurance and other financial products are designed because we're basically an agricultural society at our roots. So I think getting Margaret into some of those conversations to make sure that, again, back to the Fiona's point about solutions designed in offices in London. I'm very confident that a lot of the partners in the Race to Resilience are very rooted in the communities that they're working with. But those are the kind of, it's got to be practical, it's got to be place-based, and it's got to address the lives and livelihoods of those vulnerable communities. And so I think in that sense, I think you picked really well, Danny, as I'd expect, in bringing Margaret as a representative of that huge community.
Can we just go to cash, please? The UK government talks about coal, cash, cars and trees. And a big concern, and Saleem, you talked about it earlier, is the cash, the $100 billion of annual climate finance for adaptation. We haven't met that goal. And, again, our analysis, our concern is that the quality of some of that money, which is often in loans, not grants, is not there. How optimistic is the panel about the cash commitments being fulfilled? Who'd like to go first?
I can give you an answer on that. Saleem is more expert on me, but on this than me. But let me just give you a quick perspective on something that has just happened, because at the UN General Assembly, obviously we got more cash from the US, and that's good. That's not quite enough yet. It's not enough from the United States, and it doesn't add up to enough from all the developed countries. But I was talking to Lord Stern, Nicholas Stern, author of the Stern Review and the world's leading climate economist, the other day. And he said something very heartening, which is that he thinks that the 100 billion pledge, the pledge that was made at Copenhagen in 2009, that we'd provide 100 billion to poor countries from 2020. That he thinks will be met in the next year or two. And so that, I think, is very encouraging for COP26. It's not in the bag, but it's good that things are moving. So I just wanted to give you that little piece of good news.
Yeah, that is very encouraging to hear. Saleem, you wanted to come in.
Right, thank you very much. So a couple of quick points. Firstly, the 100 billion was supposed to have been delivered in 2020. So it's not about doing it now. It's fulfilling an obligation that was not met. And Oxfam's analysis of even the amounts that they did provide is, as Danny said, problematic in terms of what they counted as genuine finance for climate. But the important thing from my perspective, since I work with vulnerable countries and vulnerable communities, was that half of that money was supposed to have gone, or at least we had asked for it to go to support adaptation in the most vulnerable countries. But only 20% of that was spent on adaptation. 80% went for mitigation, and as Danny said, as loans, because mitigation projects on green energy, for example, generate income that can pay back loans. Whereas adaptation to poor people, giving them money to make themselves adapted or more resilient, they don't generate new income. They're managing risk and avoiding risk with that money. And therefore, it has to be in the form of grants. And that isn't being made available. So the demand going forward is not only fulfill the annual $100 billion, so 100 billion for 2020 and 100 billion for 2021, not just one pot of 100 billion. Alok Sharma keeps talking about the 100 billion. It isn't the single 100 billion. It's 100 billion for every year for 5 years at least. So the climate vulnerable countries, for example, are asking for a plan to deliver 500 billion over 5 years. And that's really what we are asking for, and we hope to see. So let's see. It is really a make or break issue for the credibility of the developed countries in COP26.
Yeah, I mean, Danny, I'm also really encouraged by Nick's assessment that the series of increases since the last OECD figures, plus the more being mobilised by the multilaterals, as a more bigger percentage will get us there. Of course, Saleem's right. Everyone's aware that it's 500 over 5 years. It's not just hitting 100 and then relaxing. And it looks, Saleem, like it'll be gradually ramping up, doesn't it? So hopefully that's the trend to continue. I do think. I mean, there have been some moves towards, flagging more for adaptation. I know not enough for many vulnerable countries. I learned a lot. I went to the Caribbean islands about a month ago, specifically to look at the unique dynamics facing those kind of vulnerable economies. And I think we also need to get a little bit more granular when we talk about, the 100 billion is easy, everyone remembers it, but it's also, there are other things that need to be done. For example, if you're a small island and you have a hurricane event, you can have losses which are order of magnitude of your GDP. Whereas America, Ida hits America, it's a fraction of a percentage of the GDP. So if you're already indebted and you have an event which costs you 100% of your GDP to fix, then you're in this downward spiral of debt. So things like catastrophe clauses in multilateral loans, which mean that when a catastrophe is declared by the World Meteorological Organization or by the World Health Organization, so an agreed third party, multilateral loan interest and principal repayments are automatically deferred to automatically create some fiscal space so that the government and the society can concentrate on recovering from the event, not having to find more money on top of the money they've already got. And some better insurance products. We're seeing in the Caribbean parametric insurance where governments and now individuals automatically get paid out when we've seen this in farming. If you have a drought or a temperature above a certain level or a wind speed above a certain level. So you don't have that long delay between loss and damage and payout. So again, when we're talking about resilience and loss and damage finance, we have to talk not just about macro numbers, but around the quality of the money. And sometimes it's not even money. It's not new money. Like it's better ways of spending the existing money to address the specific issues of some of those vulnerable economies.
Right, look, we've only got a few minutes left, so I know I'm going to offend people because we won't have gone through all the questions, but I do see one from Susanna Motilenkova, who says, how do we make sure human rights are an integral part of every climate change discussion rather than an afterthought? And that's, again, when we think about people in the poorest and most marginalized community, this is a question about rights and dignity as it is an equity. How do we make sure we bring human rights to the center of our discussions on climate? Anyone?
I'm happy to have a quick go at that, Danny, because that is fundamental from my perspective. I've been working with the most vulnerable communities who are the ones who did not contribute to the problem, but they are suffering the consequences of it. So in a nutshell, it's a problem suffering the consequences. And that divide between rich polluters and victims is true within countries as well. Even in rich countries, the victims of the impacts of climate change are not rich citizens, they're the poor citizens of those countries. You know, the people who lost their lives from Hurricane Katrina when it hit New Orleans were not the rich citizens of New Orleans. It was the poor blacks in Ninth Ward in New Orleans. So this rich poor divide is true everywhere. And it is a human rights issue. It is not right. It is an immoral issue. It's an unjust issue. And to me, the human rights is the fundamental basis on which we should be coming together in solidarity globally, all of us, that this is not right. We should challenge it. We should fight it. We should rectify it. And it's a moral responsibility for everybody, whether we belong, whatever religion we belong to. No religion teaches us that it's right for the rich to subjugate or impose these conditions on poor people. It just isn't right. We should not be doing it. We should be opposing it.
Thank you. Anyone else on that question? I'm going to just finish with a very quick round. Fiona, you said earlier we can't put too much hope in this COP but we need it to work. What should we be thinking about in the morning after COP? What are the sorts of things you think we should be working on or looking towards? Very briefly, please. Who'd like to go? Nigel.
This has to be the first implementation COP. Yes, there are things being negotiated, but much more important is what are we doing in every sector, in every country, in every community. And there I'm really encouraged by the fact that the UK presidency has decided that every day we'll have a theme. And that allows us to organize ourselves much more deeply, because we all go deep into resilience on a resilience day and finance on a finance day and transport on a transport day. And you can also see that coalescing in the physical organization of the COP. Those of you who've been to many COPs know it's like a mad trade bazaar with like thousands of NGOs and scientists and businesses and countries all scattered in a disorganized way. Now we're seeing a lot more collaboration. We'll have a resilience hub that Saleem's very involved. We'll have a finance hub. We'll have a business hub. We'll have a cities hub. We'll have a nature hub. So I think we're getting better organized at this collaborative whole of society effort of getting into action mode.
Great. 30 seconds from anyone else?
I think on that, sorry, just in terms of what Nigel was saying, you know, we set our targets, we have a plan, but, you know, it is ambitious and it needs action. So, and I think it's beyond just talking about targets. We need to get into what sits behind it. So I think regardless of what goes on at COP, for us, you know, it's business as usual. We're just going to have to get on, roll up our sleeves and get on with it. So we'll be feeling very energized by the conversations, but we're just going to go on and do it.
Great. Look, I'm conscious of time. Look, thank you, Nicole, Nigel, Fiona and Saleem for joining us. I'm sorry to participants whose questions weren't answered. I hope you found it as useful as I did. You know, I quoted what the UK Prime Minister often talks about, you know, coal, cash, cars and trees. But it feels to me like listening to this conversation, it's about rights, resilience, cash, and 1.5 degrees, right? I think we're saying it's about rights of people, it's about voice and human rights. It's about resilience, where Saleem told us that this is about, you know, no longer just about victimhood. We need to recognize causality, but it really is about resilience and maybe even leaning into the sort of early mover advantage that some countries in the global south might have. I really like this point about cash, and it's, you know, that's going to be key. And Fiona, you reminded us right from at the top that if this isn't about 1.5 degrees, then we're all lost. So there you have it: rights, resilience, cash, and 1.5 degrees. And I hope that's the summary from this conversation. Thank you all very much for joining. Good luck to everyone who's going to be at COP and beyond. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone. Bye.
Great. Thank you very much.